Hello. The second week of this election has seen a stumble from the front-runner. The saga of the long-serving left-winger Diane Abbott tore up Labour's careful script. So will Keir Starmer get back on track with his new promise to get migration down? Rishi Sunak's been giving away goodies for Tories' traditional voters. All the party's campaigns are now well underway. The antics and the announcements are coming thick and fast. So there are plenty of questions to ask. With us then this morning to answer them, the Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper, who'd be in charge of that migration plan if Labour wins, and the Health Secretary Victoria Atkins. Tired yet? You both look quite perky still, Yvette.
I'm raring to go.
Raring to go, Yvette?
It's really good to just have the election actually up and running and to be able to get on with this.
Well, we certainly all got going, that's for sure. We'll talk to you in a few minutes. And in our first leaders interview today, we'll speak to Adrian Ramsay from the Greens. But beware, all of our politicians, our fact-checker will test all of their claims as we go along. John Curtis will give his 60 seconds on Sunday on the polls.
Labour are still 21 points ahead of the Conservatives, though the lead does vary between 12 and 27 points.
And away from our election, there's the wild ride of the American race. I've been speaking to one of Donald Trump's lawyers who was alongside him in court.
Donald Trump is the victim of political selective prosecution.
And for the first time since he lost his battle to stay as the Tory Mayor of West Midlands, Andy Street joins us at the table. We're very welcome to you this morning. Labour peer Baroness Shami Chakrabarti is here. And the Lib Dems Deputy Leader Daisy Cooper joins us too. Morning, morning. Let's start, as ever, with a look at what is making the news. The Mail on Sunday splashes on calls to cut taxes to save the Tories. The Observer claims Sunak is in trouble over the promises he made to towns. Keir Starmer's told The Sun on Sunday, read my lips, I'll cut migration. More on that later. And Stormy Daniels, the witness in the Donald Trump trial, tells the Mirror, lock him up. As I said, we'll hear from one of his lawyers in that trial later on. Now, it has been a busy, busy week, has it not? Shami, I'm going to come to you first. Our viewers will remember you're someone who's close to Diane Abbott and she's been at the centre of a storm this week. It's still not 100% sure if she's actually going to stand as the MP, even though Labour is assuming that she will after the will she, won't she saga. Do you think that she will stand again?
I hope that she will now, after this sometimes sordid week of unauthorised, anonymous briefings by overgrown schoolboys in suits with their feet on the table and maybe watching too much West Wing but not taking on its more progressive values. I hope, and by the way, I hope they remember it's supposed to be country first, not faction first. I hope she will take some time to consider, you know, what she wants to do, and that's literally what I've suggested to her as her friend, and I hope that's what she's going to do. So
it sounds like there's very much still an open question, and you're hinting there perhaps that maybe she shouldn't.
No, not at all. I just think it's been pretty appalling, you know, trying to bully someone of her stature, not just in the party. I've been quite moved by some of the comments and the pieces that have been written by Conservatives and others. Saida Varsi wrote a really lovely piece about what someone like Diane, as the first black woman MP, meant to her. I think it's important now for this not to be decided by fans or detractors of my dear friend. I want her to, you know, just decide what she wants to do and take a few days over that.
And we'll talk about this more in the programme, but just to be clear, when you talk about the boys in suits, you're talking about people who work for Keir Starmer?
Well, no, because I have been assured, I have been personally assured by the leadership of the Labour Party, the senior-most people in the Labour Party, that these briefings were unauthorised. And of course, they're anonymous. This is part of the Westminster bubble game. I don't think people out in the country give a monkeys about this nonsense. It's not good for Keir Starmer's leadership. It's not good for the Labour Party, and it hasn't been very nice for Diane and for common decency, frankly.
Andy, do you think it's changed the dynamic of this election?
But I think the thing that's coming out is it's not an issue on its own. It's actually part of a bigger picture where Keir Starmer is trying to ensure that he's got an ultra-loyal team around him. And I don't think that is necessarily a good thing for any party, indeed a business, any organisation should have a breadth of thinking in its senior team. And I think that is the question that's coming out in the wider dynamic of the election. Is that sort of singular mindset, is that positive at all?
Daisy, parties, though, like to have MPs who do what they're told, don't they?
No, well, I mean, Liberal Democrats are a very internally democratic party. We pride ourselves on having our debates at conference, on having votes with our members. So we like and we embrace the internal democracy. What I would say on this issue with Diane Abbott is that I don't share her politics. I thought the article that got her suspended in the first place was pretty appalling, but I think Shami's right. There has been a huge amount of respect shown across the political spectrum, but I think, quite frankly, right now, in the middle of a general election, the voters want to hear about things like the NHS and the cost of living.
And they certainly do, and they also want to hear about issues in the Home Office and migration, and we're going to get on with that with Yvette Cooper. But as we've been hearing, week 2 was not meant to be like this for Labour. Its careful plans were knocked off course by the Diane Abbott saga. They'd want to talk about antisocial behaviour and about green energy. And today, Labour wants to move on to migration, with Keir Starmer making a big promise in The Sun on Sunday, saying, "Read my lips, I will cut migration." So, Yvette, let's start then with that big promise. In 5 weeks, you could, if you win, be behind the desk in the Home Office in charge of migration. How many more people do you think should be able to come and live in the UK legally? That's what we mean by net migration.
So net migration has trebled since the last election, and that to a record high, really. And that has reflected particularly big increases in work migration. So Office of National Statistics will tell you that there has been a big increase. That's now the biggest factor. Work visas have doubled over a series of years. Work migration, even in the last 12 months alone, has gone up by around 50%. We think that that is a problem. We think that net migration needs to come down, and that means you have to tackle the issues that have been driving that overseas recruitment by employers. So we support the measures that the government has introduced in recent months, and some further restrictions on visas. But we're also saying you've got to get to the heart of it. You've got to tackle those skills shortages. And we're setting up a new system that would link the immigration system and skills and training plans, workforce plans in the key sectors that are driving this.
And if your target, your hope, though, is to bring the numbers down by how much? So I'll ask you again, how many people should be allowed to come here?
So we're not setting a target, and the reason for that is because, partly because, to be honest, every time the Conservatives have done this, frankly, then they have just ended up being totally all over the place, ripping it up, and it's discredited the whole system.
But I'm asking what you would like.
No, I understand, just to finish the point. But also because from one year to another, there are variations. So, for example, the pandemic means the net migration figures, of course, fell, but the Homes for Ukraine visa rightly meant that the figures increased because of the war in Ukraine.
But people would like more clarity than just saying, oh, we won't set a number. Maybe you might want to set a goal of a proportion to bring it down. Last year, the most recent figures say net migration was 685,000 people. So when you say you want to bring it down, what do you mean? Do you mean by 1, by 1,000, by 100,000, by 200,000?
No, we clearly want to see significant changes in place because we have seen the numbers treble. We have supported the government's changes that they've made. Those have yet to play through, and those will lead to further restrictions on visas.
Already have been some falls, in fact. But I just want to press you on this point, because a few months ago, somebody, one of your colleagues, the Shadow Chief Secretary, Darren Jones, told us a normal level would be around 200,000. So is that what you mean? Is that the kind of number?
Well, again, and I understand the question, and I know that you're effectively trying to suggest I set a target or a broad target. I'm not going to do that. We are going to be clear. Net migration must come down. We believe it's really important, and what Care has set out is commitments that we will bring net migration down. But just go to the heart of what we would do, so that gives you a sense of the differences that we would make. Engineering visas have doubled in the last few years. Engineering apprenticeships have halved. Construction visas have trebled. Construction visas are down by 50%. Social care has gone from 3,000 visas a year to hit over 100,000. At the same time that the government was halving the social care recruitment programme in the UK. So our system would say we would have both restrictions on the visas, but also have this requirement to put the new training and the skills and the recruitment plans in place.
And many viewers might think that is a laudable goal, to try to train up more British workers in order to fill those posts. And yet I think many people watching this morning will want to know more clearly what you mean by bringing immigration down. I'm not asking you to set a target. I'm asking what kind of thing do you mean when you say a significant change? And a member of your party, a member of the Shadow Cabinet, has previously said to us that 200,000 would be a normal level. So do you agree? Would that be a normal level?
And I understand the point you're making, Laura, but I really am not going to set a target.
But isn't it meaningless to tell people that migration must come down and then not even put a vague number on it, not even say you'd like to see it halved or you'd like to see it come down by 25%?
So I think what we're doing is taking a sensible approach by saying, instead of the way what the Conservatives have done is they've just... I know, but the reason it's important to show why we're taking a different approach to this. What we're doing is setting out the policies we will pursue so people can see the kind of difference that they will make. So when you look at, for example, the way that in 18 months you saw this massive increase in social care visa recruitment from abroad, we shouldn't be in a situation where our social care sector has to recruit so heavily from abroad.
But what social care bosses would say is they desperately need the staff. So who are you saying should not come? And who are the rogue employers or bad bosses that Keir Starmer's talking about?
Well, take engineering, for example. Engineering has been on the shortage occupation list for decades, and yet there's been no proper plan to make sure that we get the engineering training we need in the UK, and the opposite has happened. Engineering apprenticeships have actually halved. So Labour's not only setting out plans to reform the apprenticeship levy so that we can actually get more training in place, but also setting out plans to get more people back into work, because we would increase the UK workforce if the ambition that Liz Kendall has set out, that would be over 1 million people, more people in the UK residents in the workforce. We're setting out those things, but we're also saying, look, if you've got something like engineering or social care or health or IT or construction, those are the 5 key sectors we identify now, will need major workforce plans in place,
and all of
that
those
will show
take
how
time.
we can get the recruitment here in the UK, not simply have this continual dependence on overseas recruitment.
But if you won't tell us by how much you want to reduce migration, can you tell us by when viewers could expect there would be a significant difference if Labour wins the election?
We would expect to see the numbers coming down swiftly. We have supported some of the measures that are expected to come in next place. And we also want to make sure that we can move quickly on some of these recruitment areas that really, it's just not justified to have the overseas recruitment. I think at the heart of this, there is a difference in approach. What the Conservatives have done over the last 5 years is have effectively a free market, unregulated approach to migration. We don't think that's right. We think you need intervention, you need both controls, the system has to be controlled and managed, and you also need the interventions to have a proper managed plan.
Well, and it's the Migration Advisory Committee, which is an independent body that sets actually which industries can bring other people in.
But we would strengthen that.
I want to move on then to illegal migration. Now, on day one, if you win, you would be dealing with a large number of people who have come to this country without permission. There are more than 100,000 people stuck in the system. Do you rule out sending asylum seekers to another country to have their claims processed?
So we're not going to do the Rwanda scheme.
That's not my question. I'm asking you something different.
But that is a kind of scheme that you're talking about. We're not going to do the Rwanda scheme. The things we have to do, the first priorities is the Border Security Command to prevent boats arriving in the first place.
Well, hang on. Let's stick with what I've asked you first of all.
If I finish that sentence and then I will answer your question because it's relevant. To clear the backlog and to end asylum hotel use and to put a new returns and enforcement unit in place to actually get the proper returns where people have no right to be here. So your question was, are there future arrangements and so on? Keir has always said we would look at what works, and there are different kinds of, I think there's sort of offshore processing arrangements and things that have already been used at different times in the past. For example, the Dublin Agreement did mean that under that scheme, some people were returned to France or to Germany or other countries had their claims processed there.
So you wouldn't do the Rwanda scheme. We've heard that many times from Labour politicians, but you are saying that you might potentially send asylum seekers who are stuck in the system here to another country to have their claims processed. That might be something you look at.
Well, that's certainly what used to happen as part of the Dublin scheme, and we'd look at what works. But the priority is the Border Security Command and then also ending asylum hotel use and clearing the backlog.
How quickly do you think you would stop using hotels? Because if you did it overnight, thousands of people would have nowhere to go.
Well, some of the initial assessments and plans that we had done looked at that being possible to do within a year of having the additional staff in place. We obviously will still need to look again at what the crisis is really that we inherit from the Conservatives, because we understand really that the backlog is actually starting to go back up again because of the way they're just not taking decisions, and actually the costs are just massive at the moment.
But you said it might take you a year or so to get to grips with that.
That was our original assessment, that would take around a year to end asylum hotel use. But we are very clear, we need to start saving money straight away. It is costing the taxpayer billions and billions of pounds for this failing system.
There's so much we could talk about, but I want to raise something that we've talked about a lot on this programme around the risks to children online and with mobile phone use. Now, one of the casualties of calling the election date was that the new law to entitle bereaved parents access to their children's data that had been on their mobile phones or tablet was dropped. It didn't make it through. Would Labour commit to doing that, to making that change straight away if you win?
We do need to pursue this again, and there's a series of areas where we need really quite, I think, urgent action around online safety, around implementing online safety measures, but also the kinds of things that you're talking about.
That's a very specific thing. It was promised to those families. Would Labour do it straight away? You would. OK. Now
we would, as fast as legislation is possible, I see.
Now, we have to talk about Diane Abbott, and Shami Chakrabarti has vocalised what a lot of people, I think, have felt this week, that this was a very ugly row, and somebody who's much admired by many people in the country was very unpleasantly treated. Was Diane Abbott offered a peerage to stand down as an MP?
Not that I know of. I don't think that's the way that the system works. You have to have proper systems in place that have to go through the independent Appointments Commission for the House of Lords.
So as far as you know, she was not offered a peerage in order to stand down, as been reported this morning. Keir Starmer said for many months while this was all going on that Diane Abbott's investigation was still being pursued, when actually we know now it finished 5 months ago. Why wasn't he straight about it?
So I don't know what the processes have been. I know that when you have these independent complaints processes, then there can also be conclusions that it comes to, other steps that need to be taken. I don't know what the course of this one has been, and it's probably right that I shouldn't as a member of the Shadow Cabinet. It's not something for the Shadow Cabinet to be involved in. Obviously, I think, look, everyone would want these processes to happen as swiftly as possible. I'm really glad it is now resolved now with Diane, and I'm glad that she's back in the Parliamentary Labour Party. I think that's really important.
And would you like her to stand? Shami Chakrabarti says she's thinking about it. Would you like to see her run again as the MP for Hackney Stoke Newton?
I would obviously support her if she decides to stand. It has to be
to?
Well, no, but it has to be Diane's decision. I did listen to what Shami said about, if that's Shami, who's very close to Diane, is saying this is for Diane to decide, and I completely support that. Diane has been, continues to be a really important figure in the Labour Party, not just because of the trailblazing people have talked about, but also some of the things she did. For example, she was crucial to exposing the Windrush scandal and holding the government to account on that.
OK, Yvette Cooper, thank you. There's so much we could have talked about, but we covered a lot of ground. It's great to have you in the studio always. Thank you so much for being with us. Well, Rishi Sunak has, of course, been busy around the country too. Let's have a look at what he's been up to, whether kicking a ball, whether feeding some lambs, that old chestnut on the campaign trail, or visiting workplaces. The Tories have been churning out more policies, I think, than the other parties so far. But will it make any difference to them in the polls? Now, Victoria Atkins is the Health Secretary for England, and she's here with us this morning, so it's good to have you with us too. Let's talk about promises then, because that's what elections are about in a big way, past and present. So today you're announcing 100 new GP surgeries, but we've checked the figures and you've shut 450 since 2013. So aren't you trying to fix your own mistakes?
Hi, Laura. And in terms of promises, of course, we have put these promises forward at the election. My promise to the British people is that I want and am reforming our National Health Service to be faster, simpler and fairer. And one of the ways that we're doing this, you're right, is to build new GP practices, but also to refurbish a further 150 GP practices. We also want to ensure that we bring healthcare closer into our community. So we are building on the success of Pharmacy First, which we started at the beginning of the year, and we want to expand the services available for that, because if we can have the most basic conditions treated in pharmacies, then of course that frees up GP appointment times.
The problem with that, though, is, as we've already said, you shut 450 GP surgeries since 2013, and if you look at what's happening with pharmacies, well, actually, the funding for those services was down a third since 2015, and more than 1,000 of them have shut. So in both of these cases, might be all very well you promising that now, but I think it's going to sound to like a lot of people this morning, you're just trying to unpick mistakes that the Tories have already made.
So with pharmacies, we know that 4 out of 5 people are within a 20-minute walk of their nearest pharmacy. And importantly, there is a much higher concentration of pharmacies in deprived areas, which means that we will be able to, for these basic conditions, we will be able to secure faster access to healthcare.
But the point here is that you are replacing services that had disappeared.
Forgive me, if I may, on the GP point, we in fact have 2,711 more GPs working in the NHS than even in 2019.
And the population is bigger than it was.
And we've seen record numbers working across primary care. We have some 39,000 staff. And if you go to some of the GP practices that I see on my travels as Health Secretary, you'll see that the practices have not just GPs, but they're supported by physios, they're supported by nurses, they're supported by paramedics. So there are different ways in which people can access primary care.
And no one for a second, but the point is this, nobody for a second would want to say that there isn't great care in lots of parts of the country. Nobody would want to say that.
Well, Labour tries to paint that picture.
The point I'm asking you to address is that you're making promises today about GPs and you're making promises today about pharmacies. But on both those fronts, since the Conservatives have been in charge, there have been many closures of GP surgeries, there have been many closures of pharmacies, and voters know that, they see that in their own communities. So why should they trust the promises that you're making to them now?
Because we made a really serious promise at the 2019 election that we would ensure that there were 50 million more GP appointments a year than in 2019. We hit that target this year, and indeed we have exceeded it. 62 million GP appointments were delivered in the last year. And what that means is it's an average of 44 more appointments per GP practice. And we know that an average GP practice delivers some 50,000 appointments a year. The point about GP practices closing that you've raised, of course there will be churn around England with a population of 55 million.
It's 450, it's a bit more than churn.
But what we are doing with this is building, as I say, new GP practices so that we can offer even more appointments than we already are doing. There are 1 million GP appointments every single working day in the National Health Service in England. And so the scale of this is enormous, but we have very clear plans, not just on the provision of bricks and mortar, but also training up our GPs. We want, through our long-term workforce plan, which has been in operation now for nearly a year, we want to see a doubling of GP training places by the end of the decade.
Let's then talk about a different kind of promise. Your Prime Minister's famous promise to get waiting lists falling. Now, he promised that at the beginning of 2023, but people in this election will be judging you on your record over the long term. And I want to show you what's happened to waiting lists over the long term. And this shows very clearly before COVID and before the NHS strikes, waiting lists were already on the rise. Now, of course, they went up very significantly during COVID, but the point here is that our viewers can see during the period that the Conservatives have been in charge, waiting lists have gone up and up and up. Now, are you proud of that? Because to many of our viewers, everybody knows this in their real life. Everybody knows somebody who's waiting. Everybody knows somebody who's in pain.
So if I may just deal with the graph first of all. We know how hard the pandemic hit the NHS. And that is a fact. We know, for example, that the number of cancer referrals has increased massively since the pandemic because, completely understandably, because of lockdown and so on, people were not able and did not feel able to go into hospital to get things checked out.
But the point here is this happened before the pandemic.
If I may, I promise you I'm going to get there. So when I look at, as I do, every single day, when I look at where we are now as opposed to in 2010, there are a couple of themes that emerge. First of all, demand on the NHS is increasing at a rate that I think even 15 years ago, health professionals would have been surprised by. That's because we're living longer and we are developing more conditions, we're living with more conditions. But in response to that, we have provided 25.6 million more outpatient appointments than in 2010. That's in a year.
But the point, Health Secretary, is that I think people do not feel reassured by statistics. They feel upset that they are waiting longer. They feel upset that over a period of many years, many people believe the quality of healthcare that they receive and that they can expect to get from the state has declined, despite record amounts of cash going in.
So because of this demand, our response has been to put in place recovery plans after the pandemic, and we have seen waiting lists fall by 200,000 since I've become Health Secretary. But importantly, we have been focusing, as you rightly say, on those longest waits, and we have virtually eliminated the longest waits, 18 months and above. That is in, I have to say, contrast to Labour in Wales. They run the NHS in Wales. They have the longest waiting times in Great Britain.
We talked about that last week, and we've already talked to Labour in the programme. But one of the problems here...
Well, it's important because it's evidence as to how they run a health system, and they have longer waiting lists than in England. But on this point about what we are doing to tackle it, with our elective recovery plan, what that means is our recovery plan to help with waiting lists. We know now that the average waiting time for people is just under 15 weeks. That's 15 weeks. We are absolutely, if we carry on with our plan, we will absolutely hit that target of 18 weeks as we've set out in the NHS Constitution. And there are doctors and nurses working around the clock to make that happen.
When you talk, though, to doctors and nurses or people who run hospitals or GPs, what is the almost universal cry from them is you can't fix any of this. You're not going to affect any of those statistics in a big way unless you fix how we care for the most elderly and the most vulnerable in our society, social care. And in 2019, Boris Johnson said, you can't fix the NHS without fixing social care. He proclaimed that outside Downing Street. There's his quote. Before that, Theresa May promised that in 2017. Go back further in time, David Cameron and George Osborne used to promise that. That was a big problem that successive Conservative Prime Ministers, we've had plenty of them, promised to fix and have not. Will there be a plan to fix social care in your manifesto this time round?
We already have a 10-year plan to improve and to provide the social care that we want our grandparents, our parents to have. We have invested in that. We are beginning to see, so for example, with Yvette earlier, you were talking about immigration levels. In fact, what we've seen is a small, and I accept that, but a small increase in the number of the social care members of the social care workforce, because they are critical to delivering this care. And what is more, we have wanted to professionalise that really important occupation. And so through our recruitment and our retention work with the social care workforce, that is one of the ways in which we will drive real improvements.
But you know, Victoria Atkins, that time after time after time, the major reform of social care has been delayed again and again and again by successive Conservative governments. Do you accept, hand on heart, that that is a failure of the last 14 years?
So I would say it goes further back than that, if we're being
14
frank
years is
as well.
quite a long
but we have
time.
had 14 years. We have seen already through the work that we've done with the Better Care Fund, we have seen the construction of what are called integrated care boards. A bit of jargon, but what it means is it's bringing healthcare and social care together, and through them we are seeing much more join up with older patients being released from A&E into the appropriate care setting.
Well, there's
through
12.
Hospital discharges.
Well, we checked the numbers on this. There are 12,000 people stuck in hospital who couldn't be discharged because they can't be sent home because the help they need isn't there. That figure has stayed stubbornly at around about that level for a long, long time. So I ask you again, do you accept, hand on heart, now I think you're a pretty candid politician, that actually, after 14 years in charge, not tackling the social care system has been a failure?
May I just pick you up on the 12,000 point, because that's everybody in hospital. So I very much appreciate that some of them will be older patients needing specialist or as appropriate care, but there are other occasions, for example, people living with mental health illness, people who need a bit of help just to get home, but they don't need a social care package.
But
so there's a whole range of reasons. Believe you me, I examine every single trust week in, week out with the chief executive of NHS.
As it was in 2010. Three times.
And again, that demonstrates the change in society that we are trying to respond to through, as I say, a range of measures, not just in relation to social care, but through the announcements we've made today. We're also constructing 50 new community diagnostic centres on top of the 160 that we've rolled out quite quietly. We've had the biggest investment in MRI and CT scanners in the history of the NHS through this. And what that means is people will get diagnosed more quickly and treated more quickly. And you asked for evidence. We know that these centres have produced some 7 million more test scans and checks, which helps people get that treatment more quickly.
What about the 40 new hospitals that Boris Johnson promised? Because we've checked the numbers on that. Only the National Audit Office said only 11 of them would be deemed as technically being new hospitals, and only a handful of them have opened. So why would people believe your promises now when that huge promise that Boris Johnson used to get the crowd to chant, that has not been kept?
So that promise was made in 2019. The pandemic hit us pretty much immediately afterwards. Clearly, both the NHS and the construction industry were affected by that. But as soon as we were able to, we got building again. We have 6 new hospitals open to patients today. We have 2 more opening by the end of the year, and we have 18 currently in construction. But Labour will stop all construction projects, all capital projects. They've promised it in their health mission. So if there is a CDC in Corby, if there is a new hospital being built in Whipps Cross, I want to get the diggers in the ground within weeks. Labour is going to stop it.
OK, well, we've already talked to Labour in the programme, but just before we close, I do want to ask you, I don't know if you heard, but we asked Yvette Cooper that very specific promise to bereaved parents that they would be able to access their children's social media accounts. That was dropped during the wash-up period. The law didn't make it through when the election was called. If you win, would you commit to bringing that back as soon as possible for those families?
So I have enormous sympathy for those families. We have to make decisions by collective responsibility. If it was my decision alone, it would be a big yes. But let's wait and see what the manifesto says.
OK, Victoria Atkins, thank you very much for coming in this morning. It's always great to have you with us in the studio. Thank you. Well, as ever, let us know what you think. Email us, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or if you're social media inclined, you can get on the hashtag #BBCLauraK, and we will try and share some of your conversation later on in the show. Well then, let's go to our panel. Andy, let's start with you. What did you make of Victoria Atkins' answers on the NHS? It's so important to voters.
I think what I made of it is that you showed a graph. No one's arguing about that. There's another graph, though, and that's the amount of investment that this government has put in, and that would show a huge piece. So there's a real deep issue here, and the only way that we're going to get the outcomes we need for people understand. You said people are frustrated. The government say they're investing hugely. They've invested in more doctors, nurses. That is true. Is actually looking at the total system. And this piece about diagnostics in the community, particularly the toughest parts of the community, and that investment in primary care, for me, that is part of the solution to this, which we've spoken insufficiently about.
Daisy, what did you make of what she had to say? I know the Lib Dems are making their own announcement about health today.
Honestly, I think she's defending the indefensible. The Conservatives promised to recruit 6,000 GPs and they haven't. They promised to build 40 new hospitals and they haven't. They're talking about pharmacy first, but 700 pharmacies have closed since 2015. The reality is that the Conservatives have completely gutted public health and primary care. And as a result, much of the money that they're spending is on firefighting with people stuck in A&E because they couldn't get the treatment when they needed it. That's one of the reasons why we are announcing today that we would reverse those savage Conservative cuts to public health budgets by investing £1 billion a year to get that spending up to 2015 levels in real terms.
Where would that money come from, though? Because it's easy to say. Everybody always says, yes, it's lovely to spend money on health in the community and that's what makes a difference. But where do you get the cash from?
Well, this particular pledge would be funded by cracking down on tax avoidance. We know that
every political party always says that, and the returns are not always what they hope for.
Well, we'll have a fully costed manifesto, but the Conservatives themselves have said they think they could raise £6 billion from cracking down on tax avoidance. So the question does arise why they haven't done it already.
OK, well, Shami, listening to Yvette Cooper on migration, you know, Labour is trying to talk tough on immigration. We've heard it before. Are you relaxed about the tone from them? And also, is it coherent to voters to say you want to bring migration down, but then not go anywhere near even giving a vague number or a vague sense of the kind of proportion of the kind of change they want to see?
I have to say, I think Yvette was right to not take your bait on this number,
voters
that
want
number.
To know.
Well, I think what they want to know is that we will prioritise training up and paying social care workers from this country. I fully support that, rather than bringing in cheap labour and draining potential human resources from other countries. That is a principle that I can get behind, and it's not nasty and it's not illegal like the Rwanda plan. I think it makes sense, and it's actually the link between your two interviews, the social care piece, the social care time bomb deficit. I know so many middle-aged friends of mine, about my age, who are having to deal with their older parents who are not being looked after in the community. And such social care as we have is too privatised and too profiteered.
And it's a huge issue for many families, but it might not be a huge issue in this election campaign, even though we know many of you at home have huge issues with this. But we will keep asking the questions. Of course, our interviews this morning come after a frantic few days of campaigning. Let's consider who won the week. Well, first of all, for Labour has been dominated by the Diane Abbott saga. For days, it stopped Labour from concentrating on making headlines on the announcements that they chose. And Keir Starmer didn't really want to talk about it when he was busy launching his battle bus alongside Angela Rayner and Rachel Reeves. Rishi Sunak's bus is also on the move around the country, but there's an interesting difference. He tends to appear on his own, different kind of looking campaign. And John Swinney, the SNP leader, has been out and about, taking aim at Labour's plans for energy. But I've got to say, it is Ed Davey, the Lib Dem leader, who looks, at least, like he has been having the most fun. Now, all three of you, I do want to ask you all individually who won the week. Andy, who do you think had the best and the worst week?
So two people had a good week. Angela Rayner, because she called it before her boss, and that was brave. And then, of course, I actually think Jeremy Hunt had a very good week as well, because there's a very important point behind what's happening. He is actually setting the tax and spend agenda, and Labour are responding. And that is not a good position for the Labour Party to be in.
Shami, who won the week?
Well, we're still 21 points potentially ahead, I'm told, but I would say maybe Common Decency and Diane Abbott.
Daisy, who won the week? Isn't there a risk that your leader looks a bit daft doing all these antics?
No, hands down, Ed Davey has won the week. Not only has he been having a lot of fun, but all of those stunts are designed to deliver a message. And so when he was falling into Lake Windermere, he was obviously delivering our message about how we've led the campaign to tackle raw sewage dumping. When he was at the water park, he was raising awareness of our pledge to have a mental health practitioner in every single primary and secondary school. So we take our politics very seriously, but we also think that we don't have to take ourselves that seriously.
Well, if they wanted to try to get the pictures on television and the papers. You have certainly managed to do that. Andy, let's talk a bit then about your decision this week not to stand as an MP and really what's happened since you lost the mayoralty. It was a big loss for the Conservatives, a very tight race back in the local elections. When you announced you wouldn't run as an MP, you intriguingly said this week that you would fight for inclusive and moderate conservatism. Now, the implication of that is that you're a bit worried that the party's taken a wrong turn. Is that right?
No, that's all premature, actually. What we're trying to do in that statement, is think, hang on a minute, how was it so close in the West Midlands? You said that. Yes, I lost, and many people would say you shouldn't even be here as someone who lost. But I think there's a lesson in what happened. We got within 1,500 votes of Labour at a time where the Conservative Party's got some challenging polls, as we've heard, in a place that's historically been a Labour heartland. But we got so close. And how was that? It was because of the brand of conservatism that we followed. It was about an agenda which was about delivery, getting stuff done. It wasn't particularly philosophical. It was about responding to all communities, holding a broad church together, but the leadership absolutely in the middle ground, about economic competence and thinking then about how you support those people through. So my message to my party is, even in our loss, and this is why the moment was important to say it, because that's when you have the most focus, that there is actually a message about how the Conservative Party can win, where it needs to be centred.
And it's a warning, though, isn't it? I mean, you're saying...
Of course it is.
It is.
Yeah, of course it is. Whether we win or lose the general election, the point is simple, that you have to have that broad church, have to be centred in the middle ground. And if you abandon that, and the lesson of history is so clear here, if you go back 100 years, all the big turning points in British political history, the winners have come from the centre ground. And that is my message to my party.
And do you think that your party is at one of those turning points?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. If you look, as I've said many times, if you look at the composition of the current government, many of the most senior people in the government are from that centre ground. But who knows what the composition might be and the temptation might be. And the papers are full of all this, I will describe it as nonsense this morning, that Nigel Farage may be amongst the leaders of the Conservative Party in the future. That is not a moderate, inclusive Conservative Party with a broad appeal. And that's why it is appropriate that we think about this well before we know the outcome of any general election.
One of the other things, though, that might have contributed to you losing by a whisker was Rishi Sunak's decision not to proceed in full with plans for the high-speed rail. Now, you made no secret at the time. Maybe I think sometimes you were trying to be polite through gritted teeth, but you were pretty cross about that. How much do you think it contributed to you losing?
I don't think it did, actually. I don't think it did. I'm not dodging the question. I was cross. I don't agree with it. We worked hard to find, with Andy Burnham, an alternative, and I would say to both parties, interestingly, after the general election, go back to that alternative, which is now with the Department of Transport, to find better connectivity between the West Midlands and Greater Manchester. It needs to happen for all sorts of reasons, but I don't actually believe it was the issue on people's minds when it came to voting in the West Midlands.
And lots of people in the Tory party, and maybe lots of our viewers, wanted you to run as an MP. They didn't want it to be it for you in politics. Why did you decide not to?
So I think, again, there's an important point about the makeup of politics here. You know, we're talking to so many people at the moment who aspire to be MPs, and I have huge respect for that job. It's a critical job, so please don't take that wrongly. But it's not necessarily right for everyone who wants to contribute to political leadership. When the role of the mayor was set up, Michael Heseltine, George Osborne, they talked about drawing different people in, people from business. And that was why it was a perfect job for me. I, as someone who's been in business for many years, am naturally an executive. Perhaps an MP job is not necessarily right for me. And I certainly enjoyed the freedom and the authority to act that being an executive mayor allowed. So that's the sort of thing that must be cherished.
OK, well, it's great to have you here this morning with the sharing of freedom and authority. Thanks for talking about what happened. Well, the reason, as you all know, is this all matters so much is that in 32 days, we'll all have the chance to cast our ballot and choose who runs the country. But has all the frantic activity done much to change your minds so far? Here is the nation's favourite number cruncher, Sir John Curtis. With his take on the polls, it's 60 seconds on Sunday.
A dozen companies have conducted polls since Mr Sunak fired the starting gun 10 days ago. But apart from Labour, up just half a point, the changes in support for all the parties average out at 0. Labour are still 21 points ahead of the Conservatives, though the lead does vary between 12 and 27 points. One key figure in the polls is that people who voted Tory in 2019 are 3 times more likely than Labour voters to be undecided. One reason for the different poll leads is that some pollsters anticipate many of these Tory voters will eventually back Rishi Sunak. Others don't. But Mr. Sunak also needs to win back the many voters lost to Reform, whose 11% vote is holding up. The Liberal Democrat vote is also holding steady at 9%. The Greens are at a record 5%, potentially to Labour's disadvantage. But it's not clear whether they will win any seats.
Well, as John was saying, there was a big chance for the small parties this time. The Greens in England and Wales say their main job is to push Labour to be bolder on housing and climate change. There they are, kicking off their campaign in Bristol, where they're trying to knock out a Labour seat. And Adrian Ramsay, who you can see in those shots there, is with us here in the studio. Welcome to you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Now, the difference, which is really interesting with the Greens, is that you're the only party that is saying you don't necessarily believe the economy should grow. You say we should eat less, consume less. Do you think that that is a message that voters are ready to hear?
Well, we've got a strong message about the sort of economy we want to see. We want to see investment in a transition to a greener economy, which will have all sorts of job opportunities in things like renewable energy, public transport, producing more of our food locally, insulating our homes in ways that bring people's bills down and keep homes warm. And we also want to have a far fairer economy as well. And we're the only party being honest in this election that if we're going to tackle the crisis in our NHS, the dental desert that we have, the fact that our hospitals have patients in the corridors, people can't get the procedures that they want and need, then we're going to have to ask the very richest in society, the multimillionaires, the billionaires, to pay modestly more in tax in a way that would raise tens of billions that enable us to invest in our health service. And so we want to have a fairer society. And we're talking about the type of economy that we want to see.
But the important distinction behind all of that is that you don't believe, as the others do, that the economy should just keep growing. It should always be bigger. That is a very important principle that you hold, isn't it?
The principle for Greens is that just using GDP as a measure of economic success is a blunt instrument. It doesn't tell us about how unequal our society is, whether our children have clean air to breathe, whether our rivers are full of sewage, whether our public services are working properly, whether people can get access to an NHS dentist. We need to have a wider range of economic measures which are about health and happiness, prosperity, jobs, public services, not just one blunt measure about the amount of activity in the economy.
But your policy document also says the population of the UK is consuming more than its fair share. And you cite food and farming, as most people would agree, are as a big sources of harmful emissions. And your document then says the Green Party will use rationing to reduce the amounts of meat and dairy consumed in the UK. So how much less milk would you want people to drink? And should people watching at home put down their bacon sandwiches right now?
Well, we haven't yet produced our manifesto for the next 5 years, and when we put that out in the next...
But this is in your policy platform. It's available on the website, and we've looked at it carefully. It says the Green Party will therefore use rationing to reduce the amounts of meat and dairy food.
I don't think rationing is going to be in our manifesto for the next 5 years. In fact, I'm certain it's not going to be. What we're going to be putting forward is how we make our food system more resilient. And we're living at a time when we see food prices and fuel prices going up and up. We're really in a vulnerable situation in the UK because we're not producing anywhere near enough of our food at home. And the farmers I speak to in Suffolk and Norfolk all the time say to me that there's far more that the government could be doing to support our farmers, to produce far more of our food locally, to improve the grants that are available for nature-friendly farming, where farmers tell me that there's nowhere near enough money in that pot, it's too difficult to access. So if we work with our farmers, we can produce far more of our food locally, we'll be far more resilient to a changing climate, to international political affairs, which, as we've seen with the war in Ukraine, can shoot these prices up. And so Greens are alone in recognising we need a far more resilient approach to farming, to energy, to the way we run our economy. And that's the vision we're setting out.
And you have candidates standing around the country on that platform. There have been a number of allegations of anti-Semitic comments made by some of your people who are standing to be MPs, including one who recently promoted a conspiracy theory that Israel had conspired to allow the October the 7th attacks to take place when more than 1,000 people were killed and many taken hostages. Should someone who stated that be allowed to stand as an MP?
No, they shouldn't. And the Green Party takes any suggestions of anti-Semitism or indeed any form of racism very seriously. And any suggestions that have been made of inappropriate comments in recent weeks are being investigated by the relevant people in the party. That has to be separate from the party leadership, is a clear message of good governance.
So will you be barring candidates then? I mean, there are at least 3 examples that have been reported on about people who want to be Green MPs, who want to be standing, saying things on social media or liking posts on social media. One of them said Israel must be eliminated, for example. Will those people be off your list?
So in the last couple of weeks, there were 3 candidates who had been selected who are no longer going forward. I understand there's a small number more who are still being looked at. And for the first time, the Green Party is planning to stand candidates right across England and Wales. That's 570 seats. You've referred to a small number of examples here. But in terms of those seats where we've got a fantastic chance of winning at this election, seats like Bristol Central, Waveney Valley, North Herefordshire, Brighton Pavilion, we plan to get at least 4 Green MPs elected to push the new government to be bolder, because rather than Labour's timid promises on public services and climate, if this new government is going to take the action that's needed, we need Green voices in Parliament to push them to take the real hope and real change that this country needs.
OK, well, of course, we don't know who that new government will be, but interesting that you're focusing your sights on Labour. But Adrian, thank you very much, Steve, for coming in. It's always great to have one of the Greens with us in the studio. And there will, in time, be a full list of candidates everywhere on the BBC website. And during the campaign, we will hear from all the parties. Now, if you thought our election was already eventful, look across the Atlantic. Former President Donald Trump was convicted this week on counts of falsifying business records. He said the trial was rigged, but does he stand by his claim that he was taken down by a fascist state? I've been speaking to one of his lawyers, Alina Habba.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You don't live here. I don't expect you to fully understand what we've been through. But as the attorney for the former president for the last almost 3 years at this point, I can assure you that we have seen some corruption that this country has frankly never seen before in our judicial system. It is very real. It is not posturing by any means. It is 100% a problem that this country is going to have to handle and get a grapple on in November.
But to use language like claiming America is like a fascist state, that's a description that's associated with leaders over time who've been responsible for all sorts of atrocities. Doesn't it just give the impression that former President Trump is a bad loser?
No, I think the only bad loser is the person who's concerned that they're going to lose in November, who has to use means like this to come after President Trump. When you take your political opponent and try to jail them, try to keep them off the campaign trail, that is 100% what they do in fascist countries.
But Alina, what is your direct evidence that President Biden somehow caused this trial, somehow caused these convictions in a court, in a country that has a proud record of the judiciary?
When you have flawed indictments, when you do have this politicization, when you have AGs, state officials have no business bringing federal crimes. It was flawed in itself.
But there is no direct evidence of political interference in this court case.
This was not brought, not once, but twice. They chose not to bring this case. They said it was weak. The DA, Cy Vance, didn't bring this case, said it was weak. DA Alvin Bragg, the man that just now brought it, said it was weak. The facts never changed. This is an 8-year-old case. This was brought after President Trump decided he was running for office.
If you don't win on appeal, does President Trump fully intend to run for the office of President of the United States as a convicted felon?
Absolutely.
Don't you think that for many voters, that might be a step that they are just not willing to countenance?
President Trump in the last 24 hours has raised over $50 million for his campaign. When I tell you that the support is bigger than ever, there would be a disservice to the American people if President Trump quit at this point. This is selective prosecution, and the Constitution, frankly, does not warrant it.
And yet, from the outside, many people, not just in the UK, but around the world, actually look at Donald Trump as being the person who has incited division in the US. They actually look at Donald Trump as the person who has fallen foul of the law. They look at Donald Trump as the person who incited riots on January the 6th, and they point the finger to him, or they have concerns that he is the one who is dividing America and making inflammatory and reckless statements because he's been caught out in the courts.
I'm sorry, but you're wrong. And the truth of the matter is very simple. It's the people in the background, the puppeteers, the people that are sneaking around using FBI to spy on Americans, the people that are putting assets, FBI assets, in January 6th to make it look like there was an incitement of violence. Meanwhile, the police opened the doors for American citizens and invited them in. I recommend that whoever thinks that educate themselves a little bit more on what's going on in this country.
So you're suggesting that somehow Donald Trump is the victim of a whole conspiracy?
Donald Trump is the victim of political selective prosecution.
And if he fails in his appeal that you say that you would win, and he does end up in jail, would he run for president from a jail cell?
He is running for president. Nothing will change there.
Even if he ends up being locked up?
Again, I recommend you find the latest polls in this country from the people that live in this country, the people that need him in this country, because frankly, it's more important than anything anybody else thinks. Our people are speaking loudly. They're donating. They're small donors, and they're standing up because they're afraid, because we cannot have this happen to us.
Well, that is a story that has a long way to run. Donald Trump is due to be sentenced on July the 11th. Let's come back across these shores, although, Shami, I've got to tell viewers you were watching that almost open-mouthed. But let's think about...
just closed my mouth. Sorry.
Let's think about our election and what happens this week. OK, so on Tuesday, it's the first head-to-head debate hosted by our excellent colleague at ITV, Julie Etchingham. The first one was in 2010, and there was such excitement for kind of nerds like me. I mean, it was like Christmas come all at once, and Easter and birthday and Halloween all at the same time. But Andy, do you think this will actually be an important encounter for Rishi Sunak? He's really far behind, but how do you think he could approach this?
Yes, I do. I think these debates we've seen in all sorts of countries, actually. They can change history, actually. Remember Richard Nixon and all of that, or back to that. Remember, we all agree with Nick Clegg. So they can. It is an important moment. And as John Curtis says, the polls are stuck. So if you're Rishi Sunak, you really need this. But what I hope it will get to is how and what. So how are we going to grow our economy? How are we going to pay for all of these things? Let's have some real guts of this. Get to this question of, is there a plan or not? So it is a real good moment for Rishi Sunak.
Daisy, the Lib Dems will be in bigger debates through the race with the other parties as well. But do you think these actually still are moments when people really tune in?
Yeah, I think they're really important, actually. And I think, as Andy suggests, I think in this election more than any other, it's not going to be just about, well, what are you offering? It's how are you going to deliver it? I think what people right across the country can see is that they're paying their taxes, they're paying a huge amount in tax. Public services are on their knees. They can't see a GP, they can't see a dentist. Their children are on very long waiting lists for, SEND assessments. Their older parents are waiting for social care. People want to say, how are you going to fix it? And I think that these debates can really help answer some of those questions.
And Shami, you are a lawyer. Keir Starmer's a lawyer. His team sort of say, he'll be like prosecuting Rishi Sunak on his record. And Rishi Sunak's team say, well, look, he'll be showing I'm Mr. Security and Labour's a risk. What do you think the dynamic will be between the two of them?
Well, look, I mean, I shouldn't really be sitting here giving advice to Rishi Sunak, but I remember his debates with Liz Truss, which I think he blew with all that smug laughing. That he was sarcastic. He was smirking. He was laughing at her. I don't think we're laughing about that, what happened subsequently, but I'd probably counsel him to maybe think about how you come across as well as what you say.
OK, well, strange things happen in elections, like Shami Chakrabarti giving advice publicly to Rishi Sunak. But it's been great to have all three of you with us this morning. As we go along, as promised, we have been checking our politicians' facts. The Health Secretary, Victoria Atkins, well, she told us one of the reasons waiting lists have gone up since 2010 is because demand has gone up, partially because we're all living longer. But if you look at the Office for National Statistics, life expectancy is actually back at the same level as 2010 for women and slightly below 2010 for men. Yvette Cooper told us the number of engineering apprenticeships has halved, but that claim is based on statistics which don't really give the full picture because not all apprenticeships are included in those numbers. It's true the number has gone down, but Engineering UK, the trade group, say there's been a drop of only a quarter since 2017. And if you look at the number of apprenticeships started in all engineering-related subjects, it's actually down by considerably less. So there's always nuance. We'll always look behind those headline claims. Thank you so much to my team at the table during this hour. Thank you to you at home for watching, of course. Week 2 of the campaign has showed that Labour might be the front runners, but it's perfectly capable of stumbling. And for the Tories, they've seen that plentiful policy doesn't necessarily shove the polls in their direction. As we've been talking about, in the next 7 days, we'll see the two candidates for Prime Minister up close and personal with each other. We will see what that head-to-head debate on Tuesday brings. And there'll, of course, be coverage of that and everything else that happens in the election over the next week, right across the BBC. I'll be on Newscast later. You can find that with BBC Sounds. And I will look forward very much to seeing you right here next Sunday in the studio, same time, same place.